The sleet started around 9, the kind that isn't quite rain and isn't quite snow, just a cold, static tapping against the front window of the Bluebird, like someone flicking it with a fingernail. Sadie had wiped that window down twice already, and it still looked greasy, the streetcar wires out on Gerrard smeared into long silver threads every time the 506 rattled past. November in the East End. Half the city had already given up and gone home, and the ones who hadn't were the ones you learned to watch. She topped up the sugar caddies at the counter and checked the clock over the pass. 9:52. 2 hours and 8 minutes until close. Though on a night like this, Benny would probably let her cut out early. Her feet were done. She'd been on since 3, and the ache had climbed past her arches into her calves and settled in her lower back the way it always did around hour 6. 8 months she'd worked this shift, long enough to know which stool wobbled, which regular said decaf and meant regular, which corner of the room the draft found when the door opened. "Table by the window wants his pie," Benny called from the grill, not looking up. He had a way of talking without moving his mouth much, like the words were a secret between him and the flat top. "And Walt's cup's empty, you know Walt." She knew Walt. 60-odd, drove a cab out of a stand near Coxwell, came in most nights for apple pie and a coffee he made last forever. He tipped in loonies and toonies he counted out of a margarine tub and never once asked her a single question about herself, which in Sadie's book made him close to a saint. She poured his refill, slid it across, got a nod. Warmed the pie for the man by the window, wiped her hands on her apron, and went back to the station near the kitchen where she could see the door and still be half out of the light. That was where she was standing when the bell over the door went, and 4 men came in out of the sleet, and the whole temperature of the room changed. She couldn't have told you how she knew. It wasn't the money on them, though there was money on them. Good coats, the kind that shed water in beads instead of soaking through. It wasn't the size of them either, it was the way they came in. Most people ducking out of freezing rain came in fast and grateful, shoulders up around their ears. These 4 came in slow. The first one held the door and let his eyes go around the room once, corner to corner, the exits, the pass-through, the till, before he'd taken a single step. He counted the room the way Sadie counted it. And that was the thing that put the cold finger on the back of her neck, because there was only one kind of person who walked into a room and counted it like that. And she'd spent 3 years and most of her savings trying never to be in a room with one again. The lead man was tall, dark hair going grey at the temples, a jaw that hadn't been shaved that morning and looked better for it. Late 30s, maybe. He moved like the floor belonged to him and always had. The other 3 arranged themselves around him, without a word passing between them. 2 facing the door, one with his back to the brick. All of it so smooth you'd miss it if you weren't the kind of person who noticed. Sadie was the kind of person who noticed. She'd had to become one. Benny caught her eye through the pass. His face had gone flat and careful. She took a breath, picked up 4 laminated menus, and walked over. Her heart was doing something quick and unhelpful in her chest, but her hands were fine. She'd learned a long time ago how to keep the shake out of her hands and put it somewhere further down where nobody could see it. "Evening," she said. "Get you started with something to drink." The 3 ordered without looking at her. Coffee, a Coke, a water, the way men order when the food isn't the point. But the tall one looked right at her, and his eyes were a pale grey that seemed to take in more than they gave back. "Coffee," he said. "Black, thank you." The thank you surprised her. It wasn't the thank you of a man who was used to saying it. It was the thank you of a man who'd decided at some point to be better than his surroundings expected, and mostly managed it. Coming right up. She wrote it down even though she'd remember. Turned. Behind her one of the men said something low, in Italian, and another laughed, short, and the tall one said nothing at all, which somehow filled the room more than the laugh had. At the pass, she handed Benny the ticket and he leaned close, keeping the counter between them and the booth. "You know who that is," he said. Not a question, no Cassian Vale. He said the name like it should mean something, and when it didn't land, he tried again, quieter. "Vale. You don't read the paper? The Fiore thing, the docs, the guy they could never make anything stick to." He blew out through his nose. "That's Vale. He's about as connected gets. We serve him, we smile, we mind our business, we go home." The name Fiore went through her like cold water down the spine. She kept her face still. That was a skill too. "Sure," she said. "Mind our business." But the cold had already found her stomach and settled in because she knew that name. Not Fiore. Corrado Fiore. She'd heard her father say it once on the phone in the kitchen in Montreal, back turned, voice dropped so low she'd only caught it because she'd been standing in the dark hall where she wasn't supposed to be. He'd said it the way you say the name of a thing you're afraid of, quick, and then never again. 3 weeks later, her father was dead, and Sadie Halloran had ceased to exist, and a woman named Sadie Locke had gotten on a bus with a baby and a duffel bag and not looked back. She poured the drinks. Her hands stayed steady. She carried them over, took the food order, steaks, a plate of pasta, nothing complicated, and went back to work, and for 20 minutes it was almost a normal night. The man by the window paid and left. Walt folded his paper. The sleet kept up its tapping. She cleared plates and refilled cups, and told herself the thing she always told herself, which was that this was not her problem, could not be her problem, that she served coffee and cleared tables and kept her head down, and that was the whole and entire deal she'd made with her own life. Then she came out of the back with a bus tub, and there was a man standing by the washroom hallway who hadn't been there before. He wasn't one of the four. Dark jacket, hood down but wet, hands jammed in his pockets. He had his shoulder to the brick, and he was half in the shadow where the hall light didn't reach, and his eyes kept going to the corner booth, to Vale and then away and then back. He had a phone up near his mouth, and he was talking into it low and fast, and she was close enough, coming out of the kitchen with the tub, to catch it. Yeah, he's here, corner, 4 of them, that's it. No, nobody. 20 minutes, we're good. Then he was moving out the side door into the alley, and the door sucked shut behind him on a gust of cold. And Sadie stood there with the tub against her hip and her whole body gone very still. She'd heard a call like that before. Not the words, the shape of it, the flatness, the clock in it. She'd been 11 the first time and 30 now, and she knew what a call like that meant, the way you know a stove is hot without touching it. She set the tub down. She made herself walk to the front, casual, wiping a table that didn't need it, and she looked out through the smeared glass at the street. 2 men across the road, under the awning of the shuttered dollar store, out of the worst of the sleet, not moving. One checking his phone, the other with a hand tucked inside his coat and his eyes on the diner, on this window. She realized, with a lurch, that they'd been able to see in the whole time. The Bluebird was lit up like a fish tank, and the street outside was dark, and anyone standing under that awning had a clean view of every table, every face, every plate she'd carried, right down to the corner booth. Her heart was going hard now. She looked back at the 4 men. They were finishing up, easy, unbothered, a couple of them laughing about something. They had no idea, why would they? They felt safe here, in a diner in a working neighborhood, on a night too cold for anyone to be out. She thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that maybe they deserved whatever was coming. She didn't know their lives. Maybe this was somebody's justice. Maybe it was none of her business, the way nothing had been her business for 3 years. And then she thought about her father, who had also thought he could sit at a table and be safe. And about the thing she'd never been able to fix, which was that no one had warned him. No one had leaned in and said the words that might have changed the whole shape of the rest of her life and Birdie's. Birdie, asleep right now 4 blocks over on Mrs. Okafor's fold-out, 8 years old, who had no one in the entire world but Sadie. Her hand was already reaching for the order pad. She wrote out their check the way you'd write any check. 4 coffees, 3 steaks, 1 pasta. Subtotal, HST, the total at the bottom. And then in the corner, small in her own quick slanting hand, she wrote 2 across the street under the awning. 1 went out the side to make a call. Timed, please don't leave yet. She walked it over. She set the little slip face up on the table right in front of Cassian Vale, and she said, in exactly the voice she'd have used any other night, "Whenever you're ready, no rush." He reached for it without looking, still half-turned to the man beside him. And then his fingers touched the paper, and she watched his eyes drop to it, and something in his face went very still and very quiet. The way a room goes quiet, and she was already turning away because she knew if she stood there 1 second longer she'd give it away. She didn't look back. She went to the pass and put her hands flat on the stainless steel to keep them from shaking loose. "You okay?" Benny said. "You've gone the color of the plates. Tired," she said. Through the pass window she could see Vale. He wasn't laughing with the others anymore. He was looking at the check, and then, slow and unhurried, like a man deciding whether to have dessert, he looked out at the front window, at the dark street, at the awning across the road. One of his men started to rise. Vale lifted 2 fingers off the table, an inch, no more, and the man sat back down. "No hurry," she heard him say, easy, carrying just far enough. "Let's have another round, coffee, and whatever's fresh." One of them flagged her over. "Coffee again," he said. "And the pie any good?" "It's fresh," she managed. 2 of those. She brought it out with hands that had decided, on their own, to keep working. She kept her eyes off Vale, but she could feel him watching her, patient, putting a puzzle together out of the pieces she'd just handed him. The rain went on. The clock crawled. And out on the street, the 2 under the awning started to shift. She saw one of them check his phone, then say something to the other, agitated. They'd expected the 4 to be out the door by now. Whatever this was, it ran on a schedule, and she'd broken the schedule, and the schedule was starting to come apart. Vale saw it too. He murmured something and the man to his right slid out a phone, thumbed a quick message, put it away. A couple of minutes later, a car came down Gerard's slow, black, wet, and pulled in near the far corner where the two watchers still hadn't clocked it. Then Vale stood, unhurried, and the others rose with him. They left cash on the table. She saw the thickness of it and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and turned, and across the whole width of the diner, his eyes found hers. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He wasn't the kind to leave a thing on his face for anyone to read. But she saw him see her, and she saw the weight of what he'd understood, and then he stepped out into the sleet. She went to the window before she could stop herself. They walked to a car parked right out front. The two under the awning were moving now off the curb, hands going inside their coats. And then the black car that had come down the block eased up alongside them and its doors opened and men came out of it. Vale's men. And there was a moment on that wet street with the streetcar wire humming overhead and nobody moving, two groups looking at each other across 10 feet of glistening asphalt. No shot, no shout. Just a silence that told you everything about who'd just lost. The two watchers looked at each other, understood the same thing at the same time, and stepped backward into the black gap between two buildings and were gone. Vale stood by his car a second longer. Even through the smeared glass, even at that distance, she felt him look back and find her in the window. Then he got in and the car pulled away, and the street was just a street again. Sleet coming down, the 506 grinding around the bend. Sadie stepped back from the glass, and her legs stopped holding her the way legs are supposed to. She caught the edge of the counter. Everything that had kept her upright for the last hour drained out of her all at once and left her shaking. Sadie. Benny had his hand on her shoulder. What just happened? I don't know, she said, and part of it was even true. But she knew one thing all the way to the bottom, and it sat in her like a swallowed stone. 3 years of being nobody had just ended in the time it took to write 4 lines on a receipt. She'd saved the life of a man half the city was afraid of, and he knew her face, and he knew where she worked, and, worse than any of it, anyone who'd been watching that window had watched her linger at his table with a slip of paper in her hand. She looked down at her own fingers and couldn't tell anymore whether she'd just saved her life or ended it. The bell over the door went, and her head snapped up hard enough to hurt, but it was only a soaked couple, laughing, shaking sleet off their toques. She heard herself tell them to sit anywhere. Her voice came from somewhere down a hallway. Later, closing out, she counted the cash Vale had left. On a $63 tab, he'd left $500. And underneath the bills, weighted flat where nobody clearing the table would flip it face up by accident, was a plain white card. No name, just a phone number in clean, even handwriting. She stood there a long moment. The smart thing, the thing 3 years of surviving had trained into her, was to drop it in the bus tub and forget the whole night happened. Instead, she picked it up and slid it into her apron pocket, because somewhere underneath the fear was a colder, quieter knowing. Whatever she'd started tonight, it wasn't the kind of thing that ended because you wanted it to. She didn't sleep. She picked Birdie up from Mrs. Okafor's, carried her the 4 blocks home half asleep and heavy, tucked her into the bed they shared in the 1-bedroom off Coxwell, and then sat at the little table by the window, watching headlights crawl across the ceiling until the sky went the color of dishwater. The card sat by her elbow. Twice she reached for it. Twice she didn't. Birdie wasn't really her sister, not the way people meant it. Half. Same father, different mothers, 22 years between them, which made Sadie something closer to a mother than a sister anyway. The only mother the kid had ever really had, since Birdie's own had gone the way of a lot of people around their father, which was suddenly and without a forwarding address. When Desmond Halloran died, there'd been exactly 2 people left who mattered, and one of them was 6 years old, and one of them was Sadie. And Sadie had decided in the space of one bad afternoon that whatever it cost, the 6-year-old was going to get to grow up ordinary, get to have a life with nothing interesting in it at all. She'd nearly pulled it off. 2 years now, Birdie had been the loudest, most stubborn, most gap-toothed ordinary kid in the 2nd grade at the school on Ashdale. She left her runners in the middle of the floor. She had opinions about which Timbits were superior. She had no idea her name wasn't the name she'd been born with, and Sadie meant to keep it that way for as long as the world would let her. The world, it turned out, had let her until 9:52 the night before. She was standing at the counter of the Bluebird the next afternoon, on the early shift she'd traded for, because she couldn't stand her own apartment, when he came in again. Cassian Vale, alone this time, in a different coat, sliding into the same corner booth like it had been waiting for him. He set a folded newspaper on the table and looked up and found her before she'd even finished registering that he was there. Benny made a low sound at the grill. "Nope," he said. No, I've got it," Sadie said. "Sadie, Benny, I've got it." She took the pot over. Her hands, traitorously, were steady. "Refill? Please." He slid his cup toward her. In the flat afternoon light, he looked less like a roomer and more like a tired man in his 30s. The line of his jaw, the grey in his eyes, a small scar through one eyebrow she hadn't seen in the dark. "And I'd like a few minutes of your time, Miss Halloran, when you can spare it." The pot stopped mid-pour, just for a second. Then she finished pouring, set it down, and made herself breathe. "I go by Locke," she said. "I know what you go by." He said it without any cruelty in it, which somehow made it worse. "Sit for a minute, please. I'm not here to make your day harder than I already have." She glanced back at Benny, at the near-empty room, at the ordinary afternoon she'd been so carefully standing inside of. And she pulled out the chair across from him and sat, because she understood by now that the choice had already been made for her the night before. "The two men across the street," Vale said quietly. "They weren't standing out in freezing rain for the view. They were there to make sure I didn't walk out of this room. You changed that. Whatever your reasons, you saved my life last night, and I'm not a man who lets a debt like that go unpaid. I don't want your gratitude. I'm not offering gratitude." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, a small, precise motion. "I'm offering protection, because if those men were watching me last night, they were watching this window, and if they were watching this window, they saw a waitress stand at my table with a piece of paper in her hand, and then saw me change my mind about leaving. It doesn't take much to connect those two things, which means, as of last night, you're on a list you very much do not want to be on. And I would guess, from the fact that you've been 3 different people in the last 3 years, that you already know how a list like that works." The floor seemed to tilt under her. She'd been so fixed on the danger in the moment that she hadn't done the next piece of arithmetic, the piece he'd just done out loud, and now that it was said, she couldn't unhear it. "You're trying to scare me," she said, but it came out thin. "I'm trying to tell you the truth. There's a difference, and you'll learn to tell them apart the longer you know me." He leaned back. "You put yourself on their radar when you put yourself between me and them. And these are not people who forget. Why would they care about a waitress?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "Because you stopped being a waitress the second you interfered." He paused, and something changed in his face, went from careful to something closer to honest. "Your name is Sadie Halloran. Your father was Desmond Halloran. He kept books for people he shouldn't have, and then he decided to stop, and he made the mistake of thinking he could just walk away from Corrado Fiore. He couldn't. You know that, because you're the one who packed a bag and disappeared with a little girl 3 weeks later and hasn't stood still since." Every word was a door closing. She sat with her hands knotted in her lap. "How?" she said. "I have resources. When someone saves my life, I find out why." He watched her. "So I'll ask you the only question I actually came here to ask. Why did you do it? You didn't know me. Most people in that room would have looked at the floor and served the coffee and gone home and slept fine. You didn't. Why?" She looked at the window instead of at him. Sleet had turned to a thin grey rain overnight, and it beaded on the glass. She thought about the phone call in the dark hallway in Montreal. Her father's back, the name he'd said once and never again. "Because nobody warned my dad," she said finally. The words came out flat and small. He sat at a table too. Somebody could have leaned over and told him what was coming, and nobody did. And I've spent 3 years thinking about how different everything would be if one person had just said something. She made herself look at him. "So when I saw those men outside, I thought, I can't fix the one that matters, but maybe I can do the thing nobody did, even if it's for a stranger. Even if the stranger's a criminal." "A criminal," he repeated, and there was the ghost of something dry in it. "Your word for yourself is your own business," she said. "That was mine." For a moment he didn't answer. Then he reached into his coat and took out a photograph, small, worn soft at the corners, and set it on the table between them. A young man, maybe 20, grinning, arms slung around the neck of a golden dog, both of them squinting into summer light. "My brother," Vale said. "Renzo. He was going to be an engineer. He wanted nothing to do with any of it. The family, the business, the whole ugly weight of it. He was the one good, clean thing our name ever made." His jaw worked. 9 years ago, he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Fiore's people. He tried to run. He tried to hide. He was clever and he was careful, and he had a big brother with money and reach, and it didn't matter. They found him in 11 weeks, and by the time I got there, I was too late. He turned the photograph face down, gently, the way you'd close a book you loved. "So when I heard what you did and why, I had you looked into, not to threaten you, to make sure you're safe, because you did for a stranger the exact thing I would have given the rest of my life to have someone do for him." Sadie realized her eyes had filled. She wiped them with the back of her wrist, angry at herself. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your brother. So am I every day." He straightened. Which is why I'm not going to let Fiore's people put a little girl named Beatrice through what they put Renzo through. You have a sister, Miss Halloran. If they've traced you to this diner, they can trace you to a school on Ashdale. I'd very much like to make sure they never get the chance. The mention of Birdie's name, her real one, the one nobody living was supposed to know, went through Sadie like a current. She was up out of the chair before she'd decided to stand. You stay away from her. I have people watching her school as of this morning, he said, unruffled, unhurried, and it was that steadiness, not the words, that made her believe him. Not to frighten you. There was a grey sedan on Ashdale at drop-off that shouldn't have been there. My people moved it along. It'll be back. That's the truth, and I think you already knew a version of it in your gut, which is why you're standing up instead of laughing me out of the room. She sat back down slowly because her legs had stopped being reliable. What do you want from me? She said. I want the same thing you want, whether you've admitted it or not. I want Corrado Fiore to answer for what he's done. To my brother, to your father, to a list of people longer than either of us wants to think about. And I want him to do it in a way that means neither of us ever has to look over our shoulder again. And to get there, I need someone who can put names to faces, who understands how these people move, who can help me and the people I trust in the RCMT build something that actually sticks. He met her eyes. You are, unfortunately for you, exactly that someone. And I am, unfortunately for me, exactly the person who can keep you and your sister alive while we do it. You're asking me to walk deeper into the thing I've spent 3 years trying to walk out of. I'm asking you to stop running, because running hasn't worked, and it was never going to. The past caught you anyway. It always does. He said it without any triumph in it, almost gently. But this time you don't have to face it with nothing. This time you'd have someone at your back who has every reason in the world not to let you fall. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the little photograph lying face down on the table, at the ordinary afternoon light on the ugly diner she loved, at Benny pretending to scrape a clean grill. I need to think, she said. Take today, but no longer. My people will keep eyes on Beatrice and on you. He stood, dropped far more than the coffee cost on the table, and paused at the edge of the booth. For what it's worth, Renzo used to say running from a thing just means it catches you when you're too tired to fight. I didn't understand what he meant until I was standing over him. He put on his coat. The number on that card reaches me directly. Whatever you decide, use it, even if it's only to tell me you've run again. I'd rather know. Then he was gone, out into the grey, and Sadie sat with her heart going, and her whole careful life coming apart in her hands. She didn't call Vale first. That was the thing she'd get right, the thing her father hadn't. She wasn't going to hand her fate to one man and hope. She walked out the back into the alley behind the Bluebird, the wet brick and the smell of old fryer oil, and she took out her phone and dialed a number she'd carried in her head for 3 years without ever letting herself dial it. It rang twice. Reyes. Detective Reyes, she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. You don't know me by this name, but you've been looking for a woman named Sadie Halloran in connection with the Fierce file. I'm ready to talk. A long silence on the line. Then, carefully, Mrs. Halloran, we've been trying to find you for a long time. I know. I couldn't, but I can now. I have names, faces, things I saw before my father died, and I have reason to think Fiore's people are moving on me right now tonight, and I have a kid to keep safe. I'll give you everything. But I need real protection, not disappear and hope. Real. We can do that, Reyes said. Where are you? She looked at the wet alley, at the grey square of sky between the buildings. I'll call you back with that, she said. And detective, I'm going to need you to trust me even when it doesn't make sense yet. There's more moving here than just me. She hung up before he could push, and stood there breathing, and for the first time in 3 years the fear in her chest had something underneath it that wasn't just more fear. It felt, distantly, like the beginning of being done. She called Vale that night. She told him about Reyes, and there was a silence on his end she could feel the shape of. That was a risk, he said finally. Fiore has had people inside more than one police service over the years. Then you'd better hope Reyes is one of the clean ones, she said. Because I'm not going to do this by handing my life to you and closing my eyes. My father closed his eyes. I've read how that ends. Another pause, and then, unexpectedly, something that might almost have been respect. Reyes is clean, he said. I had checked years ago. He's one of the few who ever gave Fiore a real headache. If we bring him in properly, coordinate instead of tripping over each other, that could work. A beat. You're smarter than the situation you were in gives you credit for, Miss Halloran. Sadie, she said. If we're going to do this, it's Sadie. They moved her that night, and Birdie with her, which was the only condition Sadie had refused to bend on. A quiet man named Miles drove them in a plain car over the Don, and up into a part of Scarborough Sadie had never had a reason to visit, to a brick semi on a street of brick semis, A house with a hockey net in the neighbor's driveway and a recycling bin at the curb. A house so aggressively ordinary that it took her a full minute to understand it was the safe house. Mr. Vale figures the best place to hide is the place that doesn't look like hiding, Miles said, and Sadie, who had built her whole survival on exactly that principle, felt something in her ease by a single notch. Birdie thought it was an adventure. She picked the room with the bunk bed and was asleep in 20 minutes with a stuffed narwhal jammed under her chin, and Sadie stood in the doorway watching her breathe and understood, fully, why she'd written those 4 lines on a receipt and would have written them again. The next days ran together into a long, careful blur. Vale came and went. Reyes came, wary at first, then less so, then all business, spreading files across the kitchen table, while Sadie put names to the faces she'd carried in her head for 3 years. A man called Silas Bragg who ran things for Fior on this side of the border. Faces from a warehouse in Montreal she'd never been able to unsee. 2 RCMP officers she hadn't met sat in on the 3rd day, and a Crown prosecutor on the 4th. And slowly the thing on the table stopped being Sadie's private nightmare and became something with edges, something you could hand to a court. There was a meeting she'll never forget. Out at the ferry docks by the foot of bay, cold wind coming off the harbor, gulls screaming over the terminal. Reyes and a prosecutor and Vale all in the same room for the first time. Everyone braced for it to go wrong, and it didn't. It held. It actually held. She watched 3 people from 3 different worlds decide, in front of her, that the version of the truth she'd been carrying alone for 3 years was solid enough to build on, and she had to step out onto the pier for a minute so nobody would see her face come apart. Vale followed her out. He didn't say anything for a while. They just stood watching a ferry pull away toward the islands, the city grey and enormous behind them. "You did that," he said eventually. "Not me, not Reyes. Every piece that's holding in there is holding because of something you saw and were brave enough to say. I was terrified the whole time. That's what the word means. A ghost of a smile. Nobody who wasn't scared ever did anything that mattered." She looked at him, this man from a world she'd spent her life running from, who had turned out to be the only person in 3 years to know her real name and treat it like something worth protecting instead of something worth erasing. "What happens to you?" she said. "When this is over, you're not exactly on the right side of any of it." "I've made arrangements. Immunity for what I bring them. It's not clean and it never will be, but Renzo wanted me out, and our father wanted the name to mean something other than fear, and I'm too old to keep pretending I can give them that from the inside." He watched the ferry get small. "After? I don't know, something boring maybe? I studied at Western before all this. There are worse things than boring. There's almost nothing better than boring," Sadie said and meant it, and he laughed, a real one, surprised out of him, and it changed his whole face. They took Fior on a Tuesday. Sadie wasn't there for it and was glad. Reyes called her a little after 7 in the morning when she was at the ordinary kitchen table making ordinary toast, Birdie's cartoons burbling in the next room. Corrado Fiore was in custody, so was Silas Bragg. So were, by the end of the day, 31 other people whose names Sadie had learned to say without her voice shaking. The evidence was solid all the way down. The grey sedans were gone from Ashdale. The list Sadie had spent 3 years terrified of being on had been folded up and handed to a Crown prosecutor and turned, over the following months, into something that would keep those men off the street for the rest of their natural lives. "You're clear," Reyes told her, and she could hear him choosing the words. "You and the little one. Really clear. Not hide and hope. Clear." She cried then, standing at the counter with the toast going cold, 3 years of held breath going out of her all at once, and Birdie came padding in her narwhal pajamas and wrapped both arms around Sadie's waist without asking why, the way kids do, and held on. They didn't move to Scarborough. Sadie kept the little place off Coxwell because it was theirs, and because she'd decided she was done, letting other people's fear decide where she got to live. She went back to the Bluebird, at least for a while, because Benny had held her job, and because there was a kind of grace in pouring coffee for Walt again, and knowing that this time nobody in the room was counting the exits but her, and she was only doing it out of habit. And the habit was already starting to loosen. She started using her own name. Sadie Halloran on the lease, on the school forms where Beatrice Halloran was now spelled out in full. She visited a grave in Montreal in the spring, on a green day, and stood there a long time and told her father the thing she'd been carrying, that she'd finally done the part he never got to have done for him, that she'd said the words in time for once, and that it had, against every expectation, saved somebody. Saved 2 somebodies if you counted her and Birdie, and she'd decided to count them. Vale kept in touch. Nothing dramatic. A text now and then, a photo of a lake up north where he'd bought a nothing special cabin, a bad joke, a question about how the kid was doing in school. Then Coffee, once awkward and careful, both of them out of practice at being people instead of survivors. Then Coffee again less awkward. He came to Birdie's 9th birthday and got roundly humiliated at a board game and took it with more grace than a man like him had any business having, and Birdie declared him acceptable, which from Birdie was close to a knighthood. Sadie didn't know what it was yet, the thing with Vale. She'd stopped needing to know everything in advance. That was one of the things being done with running had given her. She knew he'd looked at a slip of paper on a diner table and seen a stranger risk everything for him, and she knew she'd looked across a booth and seen a man who understood exactly what it cost her, and she knew that the two of them had walked out the far side of the worst thing either of them had ever done and were, improbably, still standing, still talking, still showing up. On a warm evening near the end of that first free summer, she took Birdie down to the beaches, to the boardwalk, and they got ice cream and sat on the sand while the lake went pink and gold and the city hummed behind them. Birdie ran ahead to the water with a couple of other kids, shrieking at the cold of it, ordinary as breathing, no idea in the whole bright chamber of her head that there had ever been anything to be afraid of. Which was the entire point, which was what all of it had been for. Sadie's phone buzzed. Coffee this week? A pause, 3 dots, then, somewhere with worse coffee than the Bluebird for a change. She smiled and typed back, there is no worse coffee than the Bluebird. Then, after a second, yes. She put the phone in her pocket and watched her sister chase the last light down the shoreline. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Sadie Halloran wasn't watching the exits, or the street, or the dark between the buildings. She was just watching a kid be a kid on a summer night, and thinking that somewhere along the way, without quite noticing the moment it happened, she'd stopped hiding and started, finally, to be home.